Alright, we are going to purge weld tubing. This is 3-inch tubing, 0.065 wall. I'm going to start off with tacking. Nice clean edge, nice straight cuts. Just going to put little tacks on this. You don't need much and you don't want to burn through. 4 of them, 1 on top, 1 on the bottom, 2 on the sides. And I like to do little lines, or just not dots, because you'll burn through on those. I'll put a couple pieces on. Now this is just a sample stick where you just tack a couple 2-inch pieces together, purge it out, and make some welds. And sometimes you don't always get a nice edge, so it doesn't go together. File it a little bit. You don't want to burn through because that will put sugar in it, and that will be a dirty weld, and nobody likes that. And nobody likes that. Sticking your tungsten. But it happens. Even to somebody with experience. Now these are George Fisher saw cuts, so they should be pretty good, but they're not always. It doesn't always go together, but there are tricks to get around that, and we will go into that later. You know, I mean, such as just moving your tungsten in a little closer quickly. But you really try not to dab it in, but like I said, that does happen. And then you just flip your tungsten around and you use a nice sharp end. Sharper your tungsten, the better and easier it is. But if you stuck up in the ceiling and have no choice, you can weld with a non-sharp piece of tungsten. It's just not as easy or nice. So after I get this all tacked together, I'm going to set up my purge. There's many ways to do that. I mean, me personally, depending what it is, I just use masking tape and a rubber hose. But there are purge pieces that you can use, either aluminum rings if you're welding a furl, or there are rubber pieces with quick disconnects that you can purchase for a pretty big price. They're nice and all, but they're not easy to do smaller pieces with because you can burn them. I like the old school aluminum rings or just masking tape. So you want your last piece to be a little longer, just so you don't burn up your tape. I mean, you can use any kind of tape, honestly, but masking tape is cheaper and sticks pretty well. I really don't like the painter's tape. That stuff does not stick that great. It does not make a nice seal. So it's all tacked up. And now we will start with the end where you just put the tape on. And you normally want your purge in and purge out, the hole on that the same size. And I usually just make a little triangle. But you want it to be nice and tight. Sometimes I go a little overboard, but I know it's going to be tight. You don't want any oxygen to get in there. And you want it to be a good purge as far as pressure, which if it is a good purge, you only need to set your regulator on about 10, maybe 7. So then the other end, where you're going to put your hose, this is the tricky part. You can't just slap it in there and wrap tape all around it. You need to make sure it is a good, tight seal. So I have learned a decent way over the years. That usually works out pretty well. If it's wet, it doesn't help. So make sure you dry it off nice and good. I try to go with a piece underneath and a smaller piece on top to hold the hose, and a couple pieces across. And you make a triangle over the hose to make sure that you have the hose completely sealed up, because that is the toughest part. Like I said, I go a little overboard sometimes, but one on the bottom, one on the top, and then another on the top, and then maybe another on the bottom. And I do at least 2 layers over the face of the whole thing, just to cover up all the seams, to ensure a nice seal. And sometimes, depending on the tubing, this end is a little dirty. I will take a piece and wrap it like this, so then you know it's going to stay. Sorry. Anyway, so we have our purge set up. And then we set it back in the bench. Now with purging, you usually want to go in low, out high. Argon's heavier than air, so that is your ideal situation. Now I personally can just feel it and tell how good the purge is, but that's not always the case. You want it to be up there pretty good. Now I personally wire brush my tacks to get all the dirtiness off, because if you try to weld over them, they will put trash into your weld. So you want to let it purge for about something like this, about 5 minutes, maybe a little longer if you want to ensure that you have nothing but argon in there. And sometimes, depending on the tubing, you can take Scotch-Brite and clean the welds or seams, which I am going to do. You just go over it, clean it up, but you gotta watch out that you don't get the little fibers from the Scotch-Brite in there. So sometimes I go back over it with the wire brush then. But I am pretty picky about my welds and how clean they are. And also to ensure that you have a nice tight weld, you can also tape over them. I like electrical tape. You sticky side out, go over top of it. But you don't want to put this stuff too close to where you're welding because it will melt and it will get in your weld. And this stuff is not very nice to try to weld over. I have done it many a times. And if you are new at this, I guarantee you will learn the hard way that a clean weld is easier to weld than a dirty weld. And we'll do one more and we'll see. Maybe I can show you an example of how easily this stuff melts. All right, now you can also kick up the purge for a little bit. I had it set on about 10 at first, but you can kick it up for a little bit just to blast out any of the oxygen. But just make sure you turn it back down because you will blow a hole in it. And those are never fun to fix. Because then you got to get filler wire and try to fill it in. It makes the inside nasty. All of that. Now I'm going to start off with freehand. I will walk the cup after this, just so you can see the difference and see the difference in the weld. Now with 3-inch tubing, I usually set my temperature at about 45. Now, if I'm freehanding 50, 45-ish, 47 if I'm walking the cup. Walking the cup, you have to chase it, and trying to move extremely quick that way is not always easy. So, I think we were probably purged. We'll go ahead and do one weld freehand, and then another one walking the cup. And I'm going to do this one as is, and then on a couple of them I'll get up close and personal with the weld and see if you can actually see it. When I'm freehanding, I usually keep my tungsten out about yay high, or walking the cup, I put it in a little closer because you don't want it poking out too far, just because then it makes the tungsten out, you know, further than you need it. Yeah, anyway. All right, so here we go. Let's see if you guys can see this. Now you sit, when you first strike the arc, sit for a little bit, get it going. Best way to tell when you're penetrated is the puddle starts swirling around. Once it starts moving and swirling around like crazy, just slowly move. When you first start the weld, the tubing's going to be cold, so you got to let that heat build up. By the other side, it's going to be warm enough that you don't have to sit as much. So you just slowly move up, slide your hand up the tubing. This tape, it makes it a little difficult to slide smoothly, but you still can. Now you want to keep your hand on the tubing, nice comfortable resting position, but you don't want to push too hard. You want to be able to move without bouncing around too much. You can use 2 hands, depending if you're shaky or not. Some days I'm a little shakier than others. But the key point is comfortability. You want to be comfortable. You don't want to sit there and struggle to be able to move the torch, or to stand up, or to move around at all. It's not always a bad idea to practice that before you strike the arc. You know, sit there with the welder off and run it like you are welding and see if you can stand up and move around easily before you actually try to weld it. So I always start at the bottom and go to the top. Some people do it differently, but I do 2 halves, bottom to top, usually a little more than half, because on the second pass you're going to want to overlap about a 1/4 inch, give or take, because you want to ensure that you have penetration at your starts and stops. And on the tail off, I mean, I'll go into that a little more in detail later, but you kind of move it a little faster and you can pull away as you do it. You want it to come to a point. And we'll show you here. That's what you want. You don't want a hole, because if you tail off too fast, you will make a little hole. And granted, you are going over it, but you don't want to have to deal with that, especially on the second pass, unless you want to just go over it. But anyway, so like I said, I go a little more than half. And once you start welding fittings and stuff like that, there's a little more of a science per se to it, because you don't want them to pull. Stainless steel pulls a lot more than any other metal. Now I'm just going to weld this half as is. Sorry if you can't really see it, but I'm going to do this one, and like I said, I'll get closer videos where you can see a little better. But now this side is a little warmer, so you don't have to sit as long. And you can move on pretty quickly, and you can actually move a little faster on this and on the next weld, because it's going to be warm. Now a weld, general census with it is 3/16 wide. It is not always easy to tell when you are welding, but you do this enough and you'll be able to tell. But 3/16 is a good width for it. I mean, if you're a little wider, that's fine. Skinnier, people are not going to believe that it is penetrated in a good weld. But you can also tell with the color of the weld. The darker colors show that it is penetrated. If it's a lighter color, gold, blue, something like that, it's a little more questionable. Not everybody likes to go off of that, which I don't either, because it's not a guarantee, but it can help you tell how close you are. So, like I said, you go over about a 1/4 inch. You be sure you don't block your purge hole, because if you're standing in front of it and block it off, it will blow a hole. And depending how high your purge is, if you don't blow a hole, it's going to just be a puffy weld. You really just want it to be smooth and flat. You definitely don't want it sunk in, but if it is a little puffy, that's not a horrible thing. But you don't want it too much. I mean, honestly, I could have probably had the purge up a little higher on this, but it's not horrible. And you see how gray that one is. That is definitely penetrated. They look a lot nicer after you clean them, which we'll get into that later. I could have probably turned it down or moved a little faster on that, but that's not horrible. It's a guaranteed penetrated weld. And I will cut it apart later and we will look at the inside. All right, so this tape is not melted. So that's a good thing. It is a little warm and tacky, but you just take that one off and move on to the next weld. So I am going to walk the cup on this. Now I don't like wearing a glove while walking the cup, because you have a little more control over, and you don't slip and whatnot. And it's usually good to have more than one piece of tungsten, so you don't have to just sharpen it every single time. Get yourself a nice little tungsten holder. I made about 50 of these in my lifetime. They're very handy. Well, the sharper the tungsten, the nicer the weld. Now I'm going to roll this piece over. It really doesn't matter with this, but it's going to turn into a banana once I start welding more on it. And it's going to happen either way, so it really doesn't matter. But I'm going to put my temperature on 45. Probably could have did that when I freehanded it, but so be it. All right, so walking the cup takes quite a bit of practice, and it is not always easy to stay straight with it, but I believe it makes a nicer weld. And it's just, you don't keep your hands on the hot tubing, and it takes practice because you slip and it can be a pain in the ass. I guarantee you'll probably see me slip. I still do it no matter how long I've been doing this. So there we go. Like I said, you sit, you can wave it around a little bit. Once it starts swirling, you just slowly rock it back and forth till you get a good puddle going that you can move a little quicker. But you don't want to have to chase the puddle. That's why you don't want the heat up too high, because trying to sit there and walk the cup really fast, I mean, yes, it is possible, but it's not easy. You end up slipping. So yeah, you try not to chase the puddle. And I mean, if you get good enough at this, you learn how to recover from a slip or anything like that. Even now, for some reason, this is a used cup, so it's slipping pretty good. But you don't want to put too much pressure, but you don't want to put not enough pressure. There's a fine medium between it all, even with speed, because the main thing is a consistent weld. You don't want it to go skinny, then fat, and skinny. I'll try to keep it consistent as possible, especially if you're on a job site and you want to not have your weld cut apart because it doesn't look good. And if your heat's too high, it is not always the easiest to tail off either. Now, I like 3" because it's a good size. Anything smaller gets to be a little more difficult. And I'm going to do other sizes also. But 3" is a good size tubing to practice on and to get to know how to weld a little better just because of its size. Any bigger, it gets to be a little tougher because you're sitting there a lot longer. Any smaller, it's just not as easy. Alright, so after I weld this side, I will show you the weld and how much prettier it is. And make sure you wire brush your starts and your stops. Cleanliness is key. Alright, so now, like I said, it gets a little heated up, so I'm probably going to have to move a little quicker on this. Overlap it, sit here for a second, and wiggle it around a bit. Get the puddle going, slowly start moving. Now, me personally, I don't like wiggling around the tungsten too much while I weld. I try to keep it pointed directly at the seam, the entire weld, so it concentrates the heat right in the middle, and it also helps keep your weld a little, well, closer to 3/16 than any bigger. So I keep it pointed directly at center and rock the torch back and forth. Like I said, this takes practice. I remember when I first started, it wasn't easy to keep the torch straight. I ended up with the handle sideways, and it just took practice. So if you're learning this, first thing you want to master is the freehand. I mean, yes, you can mess around with walking the cup, but I would master freehand first. It's usually the better option. That's what you're going to use more anyway. Especially if you're going to do some structural or position welds. It's rare that you walk the cup in position. I mean, I have done it, but not very often. It's rare that you have an open enough space to be able to walk the cup, especially if you're in a scissor lift or a boom lift up in the ceiling. And it's quicker. Walking the cup is more for aesthetics than anything. Like I said, once you see it, you will see it is a nicer looking weld. Overlap it, and then move a little quickly and tail off. Alright, so there we have that. Now I like to let the purge go until that redness of the weld goes away, just to ensure that the inside does not turn a color. So, it is still gray. There's the hand weld. There's the tail off. See, that one looks a little wider, but I'm sure it's within the parameters. But the walking the cup one looks a little more consistent. This is what the inside of a weld should look like. The whole way around. Basically, just like the outside, burnt through the inside. Completely overlapped on both ends. That's a nice clean purge.